All right, so we have as our first speaker today, Stu Weiss, who's the chief scientist of Creekside Center for Earth Observation, and he is going to be talking about uh, local vegetation and climate change impacts and show us a little tool that you can also access online to get some good information. Stu, I'll let you add anything else
Okay.
that I did not say in my very
Yeah.
extremely
Okay.
brief intro.
So this talk is based on some work done as part of the Conservation Lands Network, which is a project of Together Bay Area, formerly the Bay Area Open Space Council. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it. And what I'm going to talk about is how do we approach assessing risk to vegetation from climate change. So, the first thing we need to do is get climate down to a local enough scale that we can actually work with it. So climate models are typically done at a scale of 2.5 degrees, maybe 1 degree. We're talking tens of kilometers at best. And then they get downscaled through various statistical techniques to about 12 kilometer. But even a 12 kilometer scale is not local enough to really understand, especially in a complex climate area like the Bay Area. So eventually things are downscaled to 270 meters for application of a hydrologic model. And not going into a lot of detail, but this over on the right here is showing what the 12 kilometer grid looks like. And then it gets downscaled to 270 meters. So you can see a lot more of the detail, like the large river canyons are showing up. So here's our map of the Bay Area. This is winter minimum temperature, December, January, February, average minimum temperature. And this is a really critical climate variable because it determines how often we have frost and the chilling requirements of things like fruit trees and native vegetation. So you can see, San Francisco is nice and warm. The East Bay is nice and warm at night in the winter. And then you'll get up to the top of Mount Hamilton where it's blue. It's a lot colder up there. We can see some of the large inversions in the valleys. So it gives a little sense of the climatic complexity of the Bay Area. The other extreme is our summer temperatures. So here we have all this blue along the coast. So you go to the beach, you better bring lots of layers in the summer in the Bay Area. And then it gets progressively warmer as we go inland. So there's a lot of climatic complexity in the Bay Area. And the gradients kind of run in opposite directions with winter minimum and summer maximum temperatures. Then, of course, we have the fog, which is driving a lot of this colder temperature along the coast. And then we have quite a range of precipitation in the Santa Cruz Mountains over here on near Bonnie Doon, Ben Lomond Mountain. We're getting almost over 60 inches of rain, 2,000 millimeters. And then we get these rain shadows like here in the East Bay and somewhat along the peninsula. So again, we have very complex climate, but we can deal with just the weather variability, the weather factors, but we really want to turn it into hydrology. And so to do that, we use the Watershed leaky bathtub or leaky bucket model. So we're just keeping track of where the water is coming in and where it's going out to. So we get precipitation. Precipitation starts filling up this sponge, that's the soil storage, dependent on soil texture and depth. Now, some of the water goes back up into the atmosphere via evapotranspiration through plants and then soil evaporation. When the soil storage is all filled up, any additional water goes one of two places. Some of it leaks out the bottom into the below the rooting zone, and that's groundwater recharge. And then some flows off the surface, and that's runoff and stream flow. So what we're really interested in doing is keeping track of where the water is going. So in order to do that, there's a model developed by USGS hydrologists, Alan and Lori Flint. There they are standing next to a Hawaiian silver sword on Haleakala. And you just keep track of, here's the precipitation, and you, based on physical equations, you calculate where the water is going. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but there's, soil profile is really important. Deeper soils can hold more water. And eventually we come up with this factor called a climatic water deficit. The way to think of that is that's the intensity of the summer drought in our Mediterranean climate. So I'll try to explain that a little more in detail here. So this is a water balance diagram of a watershed up in Marin. We work through what we call the water year, which goes from October to September, not the calendar year. This much more corresponds to the annual hydrologic cycle. So we come out of the dry season. We get our first precipitation of the year. And in this year, in water year 2006, we had a lot of precipitation in December, and that filled up this bucket here, which is the soil recharge. So in this watershed, we estimated it's about 170 millimeters of soil storage. Well, there was excess water, so some fraction of it went to recharge, which is below the rooting zone. That depends on bedrock geology. A lot of it went into runoff, and with a peak like that, it's not surprising there were pretty widespread floods in California in December 2005. And then a little bit evaporates, but this is the cool season, so evapotranspiration is limited by the temperature and radiation. So each month comes along. We had another big month in March and April, and we can see that this actual evapotranspiration is increasing through time as it gets warmer. But then we start depleting our soil moisture, and we start developing this red zone here, which is the climatic water deficit. So a way to think of climatic water deficit is how much more water could you have evaporated if it had been available. So when we accumulate this climatic water deficit over the course of the entire dry season, we come up and we see in this year, in this place, 594 millimeters of water is the climatic water deficit, i.e. if you had been irrigating, you could have used 594 more millimeters of water. And it's a very integrated measure of drought stress over the summer and over the dry season. We can look at another year, this is 2007, which is a much drier year. And we can see here that we don't see nearly as much recharge and runoff, and that the climatic water deficit goes up to 739 millimeters, i.e. it's a much more stressful year for vegetation. So you want to think, when I talk about CWD, I'm talking about the integrated area of this red zone during the dry season. Here's what a 30-year average looks like. One of the things about California weather is that an average year would be about the weirdest year we could ever see. I mean, we just never get average conditions, but over 30 years, it smooths out. and looks like this. So in this particular watershed, the average climatic water deficit is about 656 millimeters. So when we map this out through time, this is the value for 1980 to 2009. You can see the very arid areas in the Central Valley and on the east slope of the inner coast range. And as we get towards the coast, we're getting darker and darker colors, meaning that CWD is lower, i.e. there's less drought stress. Now, if we run through a climate scenario, a very hot, dry one, this is what it's predicted to look like, projected, not predicted, projected to look like under this scenario towards the end of the century. So you can flip back and forth. You can see how much more yellow there is. And there's going to be a lot more drought stress across the landscape everywhere. So in order to figure out, so how's that going to affect vegetation? So what we do is we look at the distribution of the vegetation across the climatic water deficit gradient, and we come up with what's called a cumulative distribution function. So for redwood forest in the Bay Area, we currently see that there's a long tail here, but 90% of the redwood forests are found with the CWD less than 790. At about 850, it's 95%, and the absolute upper limit is close to 900 millimeters. You never find redwood forest above 900 millimeters. So we can use this kind of curve to say we apply it to a landscape, and we see that here with redwood forest, the red and the blue are the current distribution of redwood forest, and the red areas is where, under this particular climate scenario, that comfort level is exceeded, and there's a high chance that the redwoods are going to die of thirst, basically. But what's important to notice is that, yes, large areas of redwoods are dying off, but there are these blue areas that are still within the comfort zone of redwoods. So we can do this for a lot of different vegetation types. Here's looking at various oak types. So we have black oak and Oregon oak, which are these two curves here. Those are more mesic, moisture-loving vegetation types. So they have a lower climatic water deficit threshold. And then we get out into the more Mediterranean type oaks, all the way out here to the blue oaks, where their limits are up in the 900 to 1,000 range. So vegetation is very differentiated across this gradient. And we can come up with a threshold, and I'm using the 95th percentile of the CWD as a threshold to compare things to. If you're already at 95%, you're under some water stress, and it doesn't take that much more to push you over the edge. So here's a list of all the vegetation types we have in the Bay Area, according to this one veg map, going from the tan oak madrone, having the lowest CWD, all the way up here to blue oak, which has a limit at about 950 millimeters. And we put all this together in the GIS, and we come up with a vegetation vulnerability to drought index. So when we say it's very high vulnerability, which is the red, that means it's already above the 95th percentile. It doesn't take that much more drought stress to push it over the edge. High vulnerability means you're within 50 millimeters, that's about 2 inches. Moderate vulnerability is 50 to 150, and low vulnerability means you're pretty far away and take an additional an additional 150 millimeters of CWD to push you to the 95th percentile. So now I'm going to show you how this gets operationalized in the Conservation Lands Network Explorer. This is an online tool, bayarealands.org. Remember that website because it's all available to you there. So you click on the Explorer tool here and launch it. So this is kind of I call lobotomized GIS that lets you explore the Bay Area Conservation Lands Network and the conservation biogeography of the Bay Area. So I'm going to show you how you can access that CWD map within this, the vegetation vulnerability. So first, I'm going to zoom into an area that includes our local little watershed. And then you start bringing up, you can bring up layers. So for example, here's the vegetation. Here's the vegetation layer. So we see, the urban flatlands, and then up here in the mountains, we have things like vegetation like the redwood forest here, coast live oak in the light green, various grasslands, various chaparral types. So a very fine scale mosaic of vegetation. So then we apply that climatic water deficit limit, come down here under vegetation drought vulnerability. And voila, here we have a map. So the red areas are the most vulnerable areas, i.e. they're places that are already close to their limit. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more so we can gotta get, there we go. Okay, so here we are. Here's Portola Valley. Here's some high vulnerability vegetation. If you actually just click on it, up comes get you out of the way. Up comes a little, information, and we see, oh, that's Redwood Douglas Fir Forest. Click around a little bit more. Look at another stand of vegetation. Oh, that's also Redwood Douglas Fir Forest. So what this is telling us is that those stands of redwood and Douglas fir that are coming down the east side of the Santa Cruz Mountains are highly vulnerable to drought. And it makes total sense because they're at the eastern part of their range. That's the hottest, driest part of their range. So they're already kind of constricted into very mesic pockets, places that have a lot of water and relatively low evaporative demand. So we can, kind of click around a little bit more. So what's this area of high risk? So this is within 50 millimeters. It's a lot more of the redwood Douglas fir. So we can see that sort of on the east side of the mountains, the redwood and Doug fir are already somewhat at risk. They're close to their CWD limits. But we can go a little further over onto the west slope. Just click on another site. Here's another redwood Douglas fir stand that's only at medium risk because it's much wetter and cooler on the western side of the Santa Cruz Mountains. So in order to get a report on an area, so I can click on here and it's just, so this has let's make that a little bit bigger. Let's put a mile radius around that point. You can actually bring in like a reserve boundary or any kind of shapefile. And then going to create a report on that circular area of okay, you're supposed to, oh, there we go, generate report. So it does a lot of calculations on the fly. So here's the area we're zoomed into. It gives a lot of information about various conservation components, but I'm going to go right to the vegetation vulnerability. But we can see there's a mosaic of different vulnerability within here. We have green areas that are relatively secure. We have red areas that are relatively vulnerable, and then we have intermediate vulnerabilities here. So I'm going to go ahead. You have to create a report. I'm going to log in, and then I'm going to download the full report for this site. So I highly encourage you to explore the Conservation Lands Network Explorer, because we've made things very accessible to the conservation community, and it's used for a lot of conservation planning and assessment of conservation opportunities or assessment of existing conservation lands. Okay, so now I download it and I bring it up. So here we end up with a standardized report. It has aerial photos, it has conservation land status on it, whether it's protected or not, or whether it falls into CLN. Just a few of the top regional habitat goals. Again, I could spend the entire hour just going through this. It gives you a list of what kind of vegetation types you have in the area, how relatively rare they are, what do we have in terms of rare species. This happens to be the Kings Mountain manzanita, etc. We just scroll down, and we come to vegetation risk. So here we have the major vegetation types in this area. We see that the redwood Douglas fir on average is up here in the relatively high risk. On average, there's definitely areas that are in the high risk itself, but then we see that, oh, the coast live oaks are pretty safe, so we're well within their comfort zones. The Douglas fir stands without the redwood are also a pretty high risk. The coastal mixed hardwoods are moderate risk, and so forth and so on within that. So this gives you an idea about which stands of vegetation at this 270 meter scale are likely at risk of basically getting killed by drought by numerous mechanisms, whether it's fire, just simply dying of thirst. You've all seen a lot of relatively sickly looking redwoods along, say, Highway 280, where they're basically outside their natural range and can't survive without irrigation. If you look at the redwoods on the eastern side of the Santa Cruz Mountains, you can actually see signs of the drought stress that they've been experiencing over the recent years. So this gives us a way to hone in on stands of vegetation that are more or less vulnerable to intensified drought. So one of the key things to remember is that the increase in drought intensity, or what we call aridification, is a very robust climate projection, because the warmer summers are just mean more evaporative demand. And even if we get more precipitation, it comes in midwinter when the extra water tends to go to recharge or runoff and is not available to the plants. So I hope I've given you enough to like just go to the CLN Explorer and start poking around. It's very well documented, and you can go to your area of interest and find out all kinds of great biogeography and conservation information. So I will stop it there and take some questions.
Yeah, we have a couple questions in the chat, Stu. Actually, before you stop sharing your screen, one of the questions is if the CWD by veg type graph that you had on slightly earlier, is that available to people online or anywhere?
Oh,
that one.
Yeah, that one. I don't know whether this particular graph is part of the CLN report. So I can provide the PowerPoint to you.
Okay. I can share it out with everyone who's on the
yeah.
or the data itself.
Well, maybe. Yeah. Okay. So the data itself, you can download the entire GIS database for the CLN, except for proprietary information like the California Natural Diversity Database. And if you're running ArcGIS, either ArcGIS Pro or just the older ArcMap, there's a project that will just pop up. It's all formatted. So if you're any good with GIS, you should be able to go to the races with that. Otherwise, the data are available at the scale at which I'm showing you, at the resolution that I'm showing you on the Explorer.
Great, thanks, Stu. Sounds like maybe you can have a follow-up conversation with Sophie, who seems very interested in some of your detailed data. So, and we'll get a copy of the PowerPoint and share it with everyone after this. Great. And there was another question going back to the CWD and what it is. Does every year have a CWD, and does that mean by definition we are always in a drought?
Well, yes, every year has a CWD, but there is a kind of climatic average, and California vegetation is always experiencing some degree of drought stress in the summertime, but it's highly adapted to it. I mean, it's the normal thing. So the CWD is, the drought stress is sort of relative to the longer term average. So, the question is, yes, we have a summer drought every year in California. Vegetation gets stressed. Some years it gets way more stress than other years. Some years there's not nearly as much stress, and you also will end up with a very good long growing season. So it's just the way a Mediterranean climate works.
Great, thanks. Those are the only typed in questions. I don't know if anyone has, okay, as I was saying that, another question popped in. Is there a correlation between high levels of vegetation drought vulnerability and increased fire risk? And do we know if this is being documented?
The answer is yes. So we find that, on average, there's always exceptions, that the really intense fires that are, get way out of control are in areas where the climatic water deficit is just higher. The drought stress is more intense. So vegetation dries out. Once a fire starts, it just takes off and is virtually impossible to control until the weather conditions ameliorate a little bit and winds die down. But it creates a real tinderbox. So a really good example is like in 2017, we had all the wine country fires up in Sonoma. Well, 2017 was like a near record wet winter, but it was also a record hot summer. So by the time October rolled around and we got the fire weather, with the offshore flow, the vegetation was really primed to burn. And there have been studies mapping CWD onto fires, and you find there's, a significant spatial correlation. We also, for example, see across the state areas where blue oaks have died off. Blue oak is a really tough species, but it's died off in the east slope of the South Coast Ranges and the lower slopes of the Sierra Nevada. And that's exactly in the kind of places where it's already really close to its CWD limit.
All right, thanks. Okay, we have a couple more questions, but then, so maybe I'll stop. I'm going to stop taking questions after these two that are in, and we'll move on to Katie's presentation. But do you want to address these real quick before we move to Katie? One is, has anyone correlated vegetation impacts to wildlife impacts to predict what's going to happen to the wildlife?
Wow, there's a lot of studies of fire impacts on wildlife, and then drought mortality on wildlife. So yes, there has been a lot of work. What we're showing here is basically the vulnerability of the existing vegetation to die off. We're not saying what's going to replace it. So the thing we hope is that it's native species that are more arid adapted, as opposed to things like, French broom and weedy stuff. So, the vegetation type conversions, if you're losing your redwood Douglas fir forest and it's turning into an oak woodland, well, you're going to lose the coniferous forest bird species, for example, or, the reptiles and amphibians that live in coniferous forests, and become more of an oak woodland type. So that's, if we have large enough areas and things are connected, then we can have the native species kind of recolonize areas with the appropriate vegetation types.
All right. Do you want to take this last one?
Sure.
Okay. Will you talk a little bit more about the impacts of evapotranspiration? Our current droughts have so much to do with this, in addition to precipitation.
Right. So, yeah. So the drought stress is a function of water availability in the soil and the amount of evapotranspiration. So for every additional degree Celsius of air temperature, air can hold 7% more moisture. So as temperature goes up, evaporative demand, or to be technical, the vapor pressure deficit, VPD, increases almost exponentially with temperature, so that the evaporative power of the atmosphere is going up and water is going to be evaporating out of the vegetation. Now the vegetation can just shut down its stomata and hunker down and not evaporate off water, but you can only do that for so long until you're not photosynthesizing. So the thing that's really going to get to us in California is we have the warmer temperatures in the summer, so more evaporative demand. And then the rainy seasons are getting truncated, so that the rainy season starts later in the fall and ends earlier in the spring. So that means that the effective length of the dry season is longer, which means you're going to be accumulating more climatic water deficit, and drought stress is going to go up.
All right. Thank you, Stu.
Yeah, thank you.
Super interesting, and looks like some fun toys for everyone to play with.
Yeah, I just highly encourage you to, bayarealands.org. It's easy to remember, and play with the Explorer tool. There's good guides on how to use it, and it's just a great way to explore the Bay Area virtually.
Cool. Stu, maybe you can type that website into the chat.
Sure.
All right, thank you. Let's move on to Katie LaBarbera, who is the Landbird Program Science Director for the San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory. And she has a wealth of historic data on the bird populations in our area from the Coyote Creek station, I believe. And I'm going to let Katie take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I am going to go to Stu's website as soon as this is over. But in the meantime, I'd like to talk to you about the effects of climate change and the birds of Coyote Creek. So I want to start by just covering the impacts of climate change on birds that we expect to see and have seen, particularly in California. So one big one is changes in temperature and precipitation, which together move what we call your climatic niche. So just the same way that Stu was talking about, vegetation has a level of precipitation and water stress, which is also a function of temperature, that it can tolerate. All animals have that too, and that's their climatic niche. And as climate change changes average and highs and lows temperatures and average and highs and lows of precipitation, if you stand still, the niche is going to move around you. Now, unlike redwood trees, a lot of animals can actually move a little bit. So it's possible that they could track this climatic niche as it moves. On the left there, you see a graph with lots of arrows. Those are showing various sites in California, mostly in the mountains, where they plotted the current climatic niche and then where it's predicted to go in the next 50 to 100 years. You can see some of those are changing fairly dramatically, and some of them are changing less dramatically. But if your climatic niche is moving, you might say, okay, well, I'll follow my climatic niche. I'm a bird, I can fly, no problem. But it turns out that a lot of these niches aren't just moving, they may be vanishing. So on the right, this is a study that looked at, again, several areas in California, but I'm going to focus on Yosemite here as our closest one. And these researchers looked at where will the temperature and precipitation move, like where will your same niche move? So will your niche move up the mountains? Will it move down the mountains? Or will they move in the opposite direction, like the precipitation moves up and the temperature moves down, in which case your niche has basically vanished. So if you look at these square colors, purple and red, where the upslope and downslope aren't matching, purple and red are where your niche has vanished. So anywhere on this map that is colored purple and red, animals living there, their niche will disappear under climate change. So it's not that they'll need to move higher or lower on the mountain, they will need to adapt to an entirely new climate niche, which we expect to be problematic. Another impact of climate change is changes in the timing of annual events. So annual events like, when do you migrate? When do you have offspring? But also, when do the trees leaf out? When do the bugs lay their eggs and hatch? And then when do they pupate? And so if you're talking about something like a bird, this is an animal that is a predator itself. It needs to, most birds, at least when they're breeding, need to eat insects, even if they normally eat things like seeds and berries. And if the timing of things is changing because of, the trees leaf out earlier, so then the caterpillars come out earlier, the birds need to match that, or they're not going to be able to feed their offspring caterpillars. So this is a pretty classic thing that's been documented across the world now with migratory birds, where initially they are well lined up with the peak of food that their offspring require. Baby birds need caterpillars specifically because they're soft and have lots of fat. They're really good food for baby birds. Most baby birds can't eat seeds or berries. But as the timing of things move, the birds may migrate at a different time because of different temperatures. Sometimes they need to avoid storms. And the bugs may be hatching and pupating at different times. So if you look at the right-hand section of this graph, you'll see this example of what we call phenology mismatch. Phenology is just the term for the timing of things. But you'll see that the birds have more or less maintained when they breed, but the caterpillars have started hatching earlier, which means they pupate earlier. And so the birds now have chicks and look for caterpillars to feed them, and there are no caterpillars. That's one example, but many things are timed to the environment. And as these things change, the birds need to catch up, and it can be difficult for them to do that. We also expect to see loss of habitat due to sea level rise. That's one that I'm sure most people here have heard a lot about and thought about. It's particularly concerning for us in the Bay because we have a lot of cool species living in salt marsh, which is right at the edge of the water. If the water rises, the salt marsh will need to move upslope basically because it will get flooded. So that's depicted here as marsh migration. But the problem is we've built up lots of buildings and roads and houses right next to the marsh. And so when the marsh tries to migrate, there's a real concern that there will be nowhere for it to go. We also see increased climate variability. Stu talked about this, leading to things like drought, and then the drought contributing to fires. This is going to impact birds both in acute mortality from drought and fires, that is the birds actually dying from the drought and fires, and also loss of habitat as those vulnerable vegetation patches disappear as they change to different habitats. The birds that rely on the vulnerable veg are going to have nowhere to go, and the birds, of course, that are displaced by fires won't have places to go. This map on the right is showing is mapping mass mortality events that were observed in birds in August and September 2020. So that was a bad fire year, if you remember. That was the year of the sort of three days when everything was orange. But if you look, the red dots here were mortality events that occurred in the first half of August. Green was the second half of August, and then blue is September. So it's showing you the timing of these observed bird mass mortality events. And what you should see from this is there's sort of a wave. First, you get the red dots mostly where the fires were along the coast of California. And then the dots move outward from green to blue. And that is consistent with the way wind carries smoke from the fires. So these are mass mortality events, likely mostly not due to birds actually getting caught by the fire, but birds are pretty sensitive to air pollution. And these fires were causing a lot of air pollution and also toxic gases. And so we think that these mass mortality events are due to the wind carrying these toxic gases in towards the birds. So that's an example of this acute mortality problem. Okay, so those are some things we expect to see from climate change. One big issue with climate change is how do you know it's climate change? Really what we would like to do is have a control group and an experimental group, and you of course can't do that. Climate change is happening, and it's happening, as time moves forward, climate change moves forward. And so anything that happens, it's tempting to say, well, maybe it's something else that was also happening with time. So one important thing to do is to look for long-term changes. Anything in the wild, in ecology, in biology tends to have short-term fluctuations. It's just normal. Populations go up and down. The longer term the change is, the more you can say it seems like it's being driven by this other thing that is a long-term change. Look for plausible mechanisms. So, a failed breeding season, if you know that they had phenology mismatch with those caterpillars and they missed the caterpillars, that's a good mechanism where you can say it looks like this was climate change. If you are finding dead birds that seem to have inhaled toxic gases, that's a good mechanism. And then, of course, investigate the alternatives, right? You can rule out other things. In the Bay Area, the big one that you usually need to rule out is urbanization. So especially around here, it's been, we've had increasing urbanization, which leads to habitat loss, lots more traffic, cars, habitat fragmentation. All those things have also been happening as time moves forward. And so if you see a trend that is, increasing over time, you want to know, is that climate change or something else like urbanization? And the way you can distinguish those is that you can predict what each would do. And we would expect urbanization to have a different fingerprint of effects, a different combination of impacts. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that specifically with regards to CCFS in a sec. Okay, so let's talk about Coyote Creek Field Station, CCFS in particular. I know I've talked about this to this group before, so if you've heard this, I'll try to be quick. We are located in North San Jose, just at the base of the bay there. So you can see on the left, there's a big map. You can kind of orient yourself with the salt ponds there, those, bright orange salt ponds, and then you can go down to the more greeny salt ponds. And then there we are in the little inset map. And we are that funny little polygon that is right on a little strip of green, otherwise in a very, it's actually more built up than this photo is even from. This photo is from a couple of years ago, and there's been some more buildings since then. But we are this little strip of green, which you can see on the right. You really don't, could imagine that you are not in the city when you're there. We have this lovely riparian woodland that we have. Some of it was original, is mature riparian woodland, and then others of it had been converted to a pear orchard, but then was restored back in the 80s and 90s and has been growing since. And we do some vegetation surveys and other monitoring, but mostly we're bird focused. We are a bird banding station, which means we catch wild birds. We put little metal bands on the bird's legs. The bands have unique numbers so that you know which specific individual bird this is. And then we track the numbers of different species we're getting. We track their survival through looking at how often we recapture individuals. We can track reproductive success by seeing which babies, how many babies we get each year. Sometimes we capture other stations' birds, or they capture ours, and we can look at migratory routes and behavior, things like that. We've been going since the early 1980s. We've always been mostly volunteer run. So community members come along and get several years of training. It takes a while, but then they're taking scientific data for us, which is, yeah. So here's some of the birds we get: lazuli bunting on the left, bush tits on the right. And I mentioned, so CCFS has seen urbanization. Our specific little patch has remained vegetated and wild, but on either side, we've seen buildings come up. It's gone from farmland to, there's a mall on one side, there's some sort of big warehouse on the other side. There will soon be a Microsoft data center and an Amazon warehouse on the other side. So urbanization is definitely a plausible alternative hypothesis to any changes we're seeing. So we want to know, is it climate change? Is it urbanization? And I mentioned urbanization should have a different impact fingerprint. And specifically, we expect urbanization would impact resident birds, so birds that stay here year round, as much or more so than migratory birds. So the birds that either just stay here for the winter, but breed somewhere else, or breed up north, fly through here, and then winter down south. And the reason is that these resident birds that are here year round, if urbanization is, causing habitat loss, fragmentation, everything like that, they're going to experience that year round. So it should have a pretty big impact on them. So they should be at least as affected as these migrants that are just here for a short amount of time. That contrasts with what we expect from climate change, which is that climate change should impact those migratory birds more severely than residents. And the way to think about this is, if you think about, we talked about say, the climate niche moving. If you're a resident bird, you need to worry about your climate niche moving. You need to be able to follow it. You need to hope it still exists. If you're a migratory bird, you need to hope that the climate niche still exists in your wintering grounds, in your stopover sites along your whole route north, and in your breeding grounds up north. So instead of worrying about one site, we're talking about 5, 10 sites that all might change. And if any of those change, you're in real trouble. So you're going to be more sensitive to that. And that holds for all those issues. So phenology mismatch, the food, you need there to be food in your wintering grounds, in your migratory route at the time you're there, and in your breeding grounds when you're breeding. So again, you're very sensitive. You need there to be not fires all along your migratory route. You know, you need to fly all the way across California, right? And not run into a major fire anywhere there. So everything that climate change is causing is going to be especially impactful for migratory birds, and more impactful the further they're going, because they're running into more opportunities to hit some kind of damaging change or obstacle. So I've made a little key, which is either going to be helpful or not, depending on if you're used to writing things this way. But for urbanization, we expect the impact on resident birds to be at least as great as the impact on migrant birds. For climate change, we expect the impact on resident birds to be less than the impact on migrant birds. So we'll take that little key, that little box, and look at what our data at CCFS is showing for the last almost 40 years. Whoop. Maybe, yes. Okay, so at CCFS over the last more than 30 years, we see that the numbers of resident birds we're getting are stable. We have pretty much stable population sizes over the long term. We do see some fluctuations, but overall stable. The numbers of migratory birds are decreasing really notably, and there's a little bit of fluctuation, but it's a steady downward trend. And we're seeing that species that migrate longer distances are decreasing more severely. So think about that for a second. Look at our little gray key box. Is that urbanization or climate change? The resident birds are having basically no impact. The migrant birds are seeing a big impact. Yeah, that's climate change. So we think it's very likely that climate change is driving the substantial population decreases we're seeing in migratory birds at CCFS. We're also seeing some other interesting impacts of climate change. So over 22 years, and we've got 10 more years of data now, so we need to update this, but over 22 years, we saw changes in the timing of migration at CCFS. In these 5 species that migrate through, they were moving the timing of when they're migrating through. And over 27 years, birds at CCFS have actually changed their size. They've become larger and they have longer wings. And we think that this is adaptive for handling greater climate variability. Longer wings help you migrate further distances. Larger body size makes you more resilient to situations like temporary famine, things like that. So we think that they're adapting to increasingly stressful, unpredictable conditions. And that all sounds bad. So I just wanted to end by saying that these birds are decreasing and they're being impacted, but they're still around, and we can still try to make things better for them. So just last week, we caught a female and her young baby in the nets. We caught them together. So that's why I'm pretty sure this is her baby. These are yellow warblers. They bred at CCFS, you know, in the past, like in the 50s, haven't bred there since then, but then we caught them there this past week. And this is a young enough baby that he pretty much has to have been hatched at CCFS. He shouldn't have been going long distances at this age. So these birds are decreasing, but they're still there. And we should, you know, try to make sure that continues. And that's what I've got for you.
Thank you, Katie. We do have some questions / comments coming in. So how about let's start with this first one. It's about lighting in urban areas and how
Yeah.
lighting is extremely harmful to migratory birds, often more so than resident birds. So that would seem to mean that it's difficult to discern a pattern that's different for climate change versus urbanization.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, so that does throw a little bit of a wrench in. These are sort of broad generalizations that I'm making. We still, yeah, I'm trying to think how to say this. We still do see lighting impacts on our resident birds around here. We also, yeah, I mean, I guess I want to say yes, basically, I agree. It's more complicated than just those simple things. But there's ways that you can model it and look at whose route is going past where. And we do that. Yeah, and we are seeing light. I mean, CCFS is small enough that even right where we are, the light shines through the trees. Sometimes we try to catch owls at night, and it's really striking how bright, those billboards go for miles. So yeah, absolutely. That's a big thing and a big issue for migratory birds too.
Thanks. Okay, another question is how to tell if birds are changing their migration routes. Do other birding stations see similar trends?
Yeah, so they don't seem to be changing their routes as much as, I mean, you might think that would be a good approach to this. It seems like the routes are staying pretty similar. Mostly what we're seeing is changes in timing. I would love to know if they're changing them sort of opportunistically. In the case of fires, you really need tracking on the birds to do that, just because even though there's like tens of banding stations in every state, that's not enough to recapture birds often enough to really know if they're changing their migrant routes. So what you need is to be able to put little trackers on them, which we can do. It's just expensive, but we're actively trying to put up more of these tracking towers so that we can do that more with our migratory birds. We do know, not for the fires, but for hurricanes, it's been documented that the birds will change their migratory routes to get out of the way of hurricanes. So there's a good chance that they're moving out of the way of fires individually. Long-term changes in migratory routes we're not really seeing.
And the second part of that question was, do other birding stations see similar trends?
Yeah, so the decrease in migratory birds specifically is really widespread. Yeah, it's all across North America for sure. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Next question, could you provide more detailed references for the studies featured in the first part of your talk?
I can. In what format? So yeah, so these two on this slide, Barton and Sandercock and Goodman et al., these are on our website, the SFVBO website. There's a section of papers featuring CCFS data. The earlier ones are mostly, let's see, there was Morgan Tingley, yes, and Yang et al. I can type them in the chat if you give me a couple minutes after I stop sharing my screen. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. There are more questions. Okay. Do you know? Okay, people keep typing and then the question pops up while I'm reading it. Let me listen. Okay, here we go. Do you know if the plans for more development in the area include any bird-friendlier design? Which is also being slightly answered in the chat by.
Yeah, it looks like Rachel's kind of got that one.
Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not really keyed in on the development side. I know there's a few fights going on. There was some development encroaching on the creek, for example, in San Jose that was being fought. There was that idea for that sort of light sculpture thing, which seems to have stalled, I hope. So certainly folks are pushing back against the really harmful things. That's not my main area of knowledge. But certainly also just other, like it's not just development that changes things for the birds, but like other climate change mitigation things like the Salt Pond Restoration Project. They're taking a lot of care to monitor how that's going to impact birds, because anytime you change habitat for one species of bird, you may be changing habitat another species is relying on. So that kind of sort of conservation development is definitely thinking about these things.
Okay, next question. Are analyses done to measure levels of toxins from forest fires in bird blood levels, feathers, other organs?
Yeah, so that was part of that Yang et al. Study that was looking at the forest fires. We're not specifically doing that just because we don't have a lab that has asked us to do that. We do at a different site collect some feathers to look for mercury, which is not a forest fire situation, but is a thing that someone at Stanford is studying. But certainly other folks are doing that.
Great. Sounds like there's a lot of good resources out there. And thank you, Shawnee, for sharing that the Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society does work on bird-friendly design. And folks can contact Shawnee with any info on your local area. Here's another question. Are you starting to see some species that you haven't seen before?
We haven't like seen species we've never ever seen before, but we are seeing changes. So this year we've seen a lot more white-breasted nuthatches for whatever reason. We're still trying to figure that one out. And this bird here on my title slide is a Hutton's vireo. And we've always caught those in the winter, but this year was the first year that we found them breeding. And there were at least 2 sets of breeding pairs that successfully fledged chicks. So we are seeing changes. It's again, it's a little hard to know how much of that is climate change and how much of it is sort of the ongoing growth of these restored riparian ecosystems. They were restored, 20 to 30 years ago. So it might be that some of these are just maturing well enough to be attractive to birds now. But we definitely see changes. And again, the whole problem is you see a change and then you say, well, is this a fluke or is this the trend? And then you have to wait 8 years to find out if it's real.
All right, stay tuned. We'll welcome you back.
Yeah.
Now. I think our influx of questions has slowed down here. So maybe we can thank Katie and also Stu again for joining us today. It's been really interesting. Thank you so much.